Good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. It's nice to have folks here in person after such a long break. And I'd like to also welcome everyone watching us on Zoom. I'm Brent Iacobucci, Acting Director of the Kluge Center. Before we begin today's program, please take a moment to silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. I'll also remind you that today's program is being taped for publication later to the Kluge Center website, as well as our YouTube and iTunes channels. The Kluge Center was founded in 2000 thanks to a generous donation by philanthropist John W. Kluge. The center is a vibrant community of scholarship on Capitol Hill. We bring together scholars and researchers from around the world to use the library's rich collections and to interact with lawmakers, policymakers, and the public. We offer opportunities for scholars at every level. We also administer the Kluge Prize for the Achievement of Study in Humanity, which was previously awarded to Danielle Allen, and which will be awarded again this summer. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Tamika Nunley, Associate Professor of History at Cornell University, about her book, At the Threshold of Liberty, Women, Slavery, and Shifting Identities in Washington, D.C., which was published in 2021. After our discussion, next door, the LSC shop will be selling copies of the book, and Dr. Nunley has graciously offered to sign copies. At the Threshold of Liberty discusses how African-American women, enslaved, fugitive, and free, claimed new identities and lives in a city built on the idea of freedom, but which was far from free for all citizens. Thank you, Dr. Nunley, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So how did you arrive at the topic of Black women in early Washington? What kinds of questions led you to write this book?
It's interesting. A lot of historians of the Civil War era are concerned with a big question, right? And one of these questions is, who freed the slaves? And I kind of started off with that question as a graduate student, really interested in what Black women were doing in Washington, D.C. in particular, because it was becoming increasingly symbolic as a fortress for the Union government and for Lincoln. But it was this really oddly kind of southern space as well that was surrounded by Maryland and Virginia, which were both slaveholding states. And so I became interested in the question of, was it the enslaved people themselves? Was it the government, especially given the proximity of these women to the Capitol and to powerful leaders and decision makers? Or was something else happening that maybe we hadn't considered, right? And so being a good graduate student at the time, I did my due diligence and sort of answered that question within the parameters that historians typically answer them. And I kind of landed at, it was actually a collaborative effort. It wasn't necessarily a patronizing process in which the government is bestowing freedom, but it was more of a sort of a mutually reinforcing process between the enslaved, military officials, legislators, President Lincoln himself, who were a part of that process of freedom making. And so this became how the project was, how this project emerged. And I started with records in Washington, D.C. and the National Archives first, where I was looking at police precinct records to see where Black women were getting arrested, because it was hard to locate everyday Black women. I could find prominent Black women that many of us were familiar with, like Elizabethckley, people who were associated with the White House or with the Black elite. But I was really looking for the masses of Black women in the city, and unfortunately, the only way to do that was through the criminal record, through the police record. And at this point in time, during the Civil War era, Black women were subject to laws that were different from the laws that white citizens were subject to. And as a result, they entered into the criminal court record for doing things like playing cards, or for gathering in groups larger than 4, or for being out past 10 o'clock at night. And so on the surface, when you're looking at criminal records, you're thinking they did something wrong, but what was defined as wrong at the time was quite different from what we might associate with it today.
So in your book, Black women are searching for ways to define and experience freedom for themselves and their families. What kinds of language did you employ to convey this struggle for freedom?
Yeah, I was interested in how the nation had crafted this language around liberty, the significance of liberty. But when we think about the founding era and what liberties reach more generally, it did not reach the women that are in this book, right? And so how do we begin to understand the scope of liberty, and how do we understand who gets to define it? And so the premise of the book, right, is that it's not only Jefferson who's defining liberty, it's not only our lawmakers who are defining liberty, or the everyday citizen, but it is also people like these women who are defining liberty on their terms. And what that means is that sometimes they have to violate the slave codes, or they have to violate laws that are based on race and based on gender. And so I use terms like self-making, right? Because in some ways, freedom became such a term that was couched in legal terms that didn't quite capture the kind of freedom-making practices that these women were interested in. For some women, it was legal freedom, going to the courts, petitioning for their freedom, litigating for their freedom. For some, it was owning property. For some, it was becoming literate. For some, it was owning a brothel, right? Or owning a place in which Black people could enjoy leisure, having a place to stay, right? And so there are all these sort of more expansive modes in which these women were thinking about what freedom looked like for them respectively. And it didn't quite work within the terms of legal freedom alone. And so self-making became this term that is very broad, right, and very vague, but was expansive enough to capture what all of these women collectively were doing.
So jumping off on that, you open the book with the story of Suki Dean, who that name and the persona she created for herself. So what do we not know about her, and why did you choose to open your book with her story?
I liked the story of Suki, and it was exciting today. I haven't been to DC since I checked my footnotes for this book, so it's been a couple of years. And I stopped by the Navy Yard today, and the Navy Yard is where she escaped from. And I thought about Suki, and Suki's story is very interesting because I use a slave runaway ad. This is a source that historians use quite often and quite frequently. And typically how we'll use it is we'll say, this person ran away from this slave owner, right? This slave owner was such and such, and this is the information that they provided. But what I began to see was something different. I took a very typical slave ad, right, that was advertising the escape of this Black woman. And in this ad, it said that Suki Dean is, we call her Suri. She's going about the Navy Yard, hiring herself out as a free woman. She now goes by the name of Suki Dean. And I just thought that that was really powerful and a really great anecdote to begin to understand the concept of self-making, rather than just sort of solely fixating on her fugitivity, right? Beginning to think about how she saw her life on her terms. And so she has the audacity to go about the city, which DC at this time in the early 19th century is really kind of a shoddy village, right? And so everybody kind of knows each other. And it's not as big and bustling as it is now. But at the time, it was quite a risk to sort of escape in the city, right? And then say, I'm free, and my name is Suki Dean. And so the question I had was, at what point did she become Suki Dean, right? Did she decide that she was going to be Suki Dean the day she escaped? Or had she been thinking about it for decades? And I thought that that was really powerful, because now the book then sort of transformed from a dissertation that was fixated on a question that historians get preoccupied with to a different kind of question. At what point did Black women begin seeking liberty? Did it happen during the War of 1812 or the American Revolution because opportunity presented itself? Or had they just been struggling for liberty since they got here, right? And that's kind of where I landed at. And women like Suki helped me tell that story.
That's great. So in this book, you examine the lives of Black women, but it's also a story about Washington, D.C. So how did Black women shape life in Washington?
Very interesting. I mean, these women, first of all, were everywhere, right? So they're not hidden in the corners of the city. They're serving tea in the parlors. They are on the streets soliciting money and selling goods and peddling goods. They are also enslaved. They're chained along the National Mall at a lot of the slave pens that peppered the mall. But they were also the leaders and benefactors of churches and schools. They were little girls who were learning things that the city thought they shouldn't be learning, right? And they were all sort of placing their hopes on this place, the nation's capital, that's supposed to be emblematic of liberty and the egalitarian ethos of the nation, and really testing the limits of that ethos and seeing sort of how far does liberty reach. And so these women were enslaved, they were fugitive, they were free, they were leaders in their communities, they were considered criminals in their communities. They embodied all of these different kinds of personas that remind us that they're very much a fabric of the city. And so some more prominent women were instrumental in establishing some of sort of the biggest churches, Black churches, and schools in the nation's capital that are still standing today. Their brick and mortar is still standing today because of their philanthropy. But they also shaped the war effort in a lot of ways. When the Civil War broke out, there were thousands of refugees flocking to the nation's capital, and we're not surprised by that, right? Because Virginia is right there. And so it's not a long trek for some folks who are in the Chesapeake to be able to come to DC once emancipation takes effect. And who's going to take care of these refugees, right? And so the government launches an effort to establish camps to help these refugees, but they don't have the capacity to do, to accommodate every refugee. So it's these Black churches, it's these women who are forming these organizations that are providing food and clothing, healthcare, basic necessities that these refugees, then now sort of citizens of the district, rely upon, right? And these become sort of the first generation of Black Americans who make their place in Washington in communities like Anacostia, right? And also in Alexandria.
So jumping off on that, you have a phenomenal photo that's the cover of the book of Elizabethckley, who was sort of amazing in that she used her skills as a seamstress to first, purchase her own freedom, and then to become dressmaker to the most powerful women in Washington, including First Lady Mary Lincoln. She also used her political connections to gain support for the Contraband Relief Association. And later she wrote her own biography about her experiences in slavery and her time as Mrs. Lincoln's confidant. That was certainly unusual at the time. Did she see it? Was she aware of it as a radical act? And how did that publishing of that book benefit her or cost her in terms of her own later success or reputation?
One thing that's I like about Keckley is Keckley's ever conscious of her public persona, right? And she knows exactly what she's doing when she's publishing this behind-the-scenes look of the Lincoln White House and also her friendship with Mary Todd Lincoln. In a lot of ways, she's absolutely sincere in trying to help repair the reputation of Mary Todd Lincoln, which is not great by the time she publishes the book. But she's also situating herself as a really significant and leading voice in the African American community, and also saying that in addition to Lincoln's decision, right, to embrace emancipation during the war, that it really is African Americans in DC who help sort of carry out what that looks like on the ground, right? They begin to sort of create the kind of networks that make emancipation viable, right? And so legally it becomes possible because of what's happening in Congress, but it becomes viable because Black communities like DC become instrumental in creating the kinds of relief efforts that were necessary for people to survive the conditions of war. And so she is doing lots of things there, right? But she's situating herself as a really important, credible voice. Now, is she granted that credibility? No, right? And she pays dearly for it because it's seen as scandalous. Even though she's not an enslaved woman working for the Lincoln household, there's still a racial hierarchy, there's still a gender hierarchy that she's violating, and even situating herself in close proximity to the Lincolns.
So the book covers a wide range of topics: slavery, freedom, prostitution, education, the Civil War. Why did you choose to organize the book the way you did?
I was punishing myself. No, I'm just kidding. I always tell people each of those chapters could have been their own book. You know, one was about slavery, one was about fugitivity, one was about schools, Black education. That could have been a whole book. Prostitution could have been a movie, right? And so I was trying to look holistically at sort of the population of Black women, what was possible for Black women at that time. Oftentimes when you read history books about Black women during the 19th century, it's a book about slavery, or it's a book about freedom, a book about the North, or a book about the South. And DC lent itself to having a more complex, nuanced conversation about what was possible for Black women in terms of liberty. And the question that I became preoccupied with is, okay, I know that Black women are enslaved in the district. I know that they become free in the district. If they become free, then so what? What happens then, right? Does everybody become a leading Black woman like Keckley? And the truth of the matter is that the majority of them do not. So then what do their lives look like? And that's when you have to begin to look at prostitution very seriously, because it is a very sort of robust sex and leisure economy in the district that people participate in. And people are clearly participating in it because it's viable, and it becomes increasingly more viable during the Civil War. And so what is possible economically for Black women? And you realize that it's quite narrow. There's not a lot of possibility. And then that helps us then understand a person like Keckley, right? That it's quite exceptional that she was able to achieve the kind of reputation that she was able to achieve as an entrepreneur. Then you begin to see schools differently, right? That Black schools are not something we should take for granted, but that they're quite exceptional, that you kind of have to move heaven and earth to start a school and to really fund it and make it so children can attend and rather than working. And so the economic component of it sort of forced me to think about the organization of the book very differently and maybe a little more expansively, even if it was a little messy.
So your book features, you mentioned your research at the archives and here at the library. So can you talk about some of the archives that you used here at the library and how maybe you used those materials differently than folks before you?
Yes, yeah. One of my favorite sources that I found here was the Matilda Minor papers. And these papers were of this woman who's from New England who comes to DC and says, I'm going to start a school for Black girls. And people are like, you're crazy. Like, you should not go to Washington, D.C. to do that, right? It's one thing to do it in the North, and it's still contentious in the North, right? It's not an easy feat in the North, but it's another thing to go to D.C. where slavery is hotly contested, right? This is where all of our legislators converge and debate the issue of slavery. And D.C. is Southern in sentiment in a lot of ways during this time. And so in these papers, there have been historians who've talked about Matilda Minor in the context of Black education in the 19th century. But she has these wonderful collection of letters that she received from the Black girls themselves who attended her school. And that's when it gets really, incredible to hear their voices in these letters, to hear the relationship that they had with Matilda Minor, which was really quite a lovely bond. It wasn't uncomplicated, right? But it was a lovely bond in which they felt comfortable enough to talk about their political ideas, to talk about their religious convictions, to talk about their hopes and dreams for what the United States would become, and to hear sort of in some ways their prophetic voice in the 1850s, just before we see the nation on the brink of war. And so that, to me, was one of the best gems that I found here, in addition to really robust collections on slavery in DC, and also legislative records and newspaper records, which are phenomenal here as well.
So, I mean, you've talked about this, that, whatever the legal situation was in Washington, it was basically still a southern city.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, educating African American children at that time was fraught in a lot of ways. So, facing political and potential, physical violence. So, how did, black girls in DC experience their education at the time?
This was one of the important discoveries of those letters, right, is that you begin to see what they're facing. And so I think it's one thing to say that, oh yes, DC allowed for black schools to exist, right? And you have an idea of what that might mean. But it's another thing to hear from them what that was like. And so for them to attend this school, it was seen as very threatening. And so whenever they walked to school, they would face threats, racial and sexual slurs from locals who were highly offended by the existence of this school and what it was doing, right? And so everything that they were trained to become and to do was a threat. And so much so to the point where the mayor of Washington said that this school posed a threat to the Union itself, right? Which is really hyperbolic, right? But is it, right? And so they knew that they were part of, that what they were doing was highly politicized. And so the courage it took for them to attend school, to get to school, to even come up with the fees for school was no small feat. And it got to a point where some of the young black women who were assisting with the school were encouraged to have guns on site because they just were not sure what kind of mob violence that they were going to face because they had been attacked and targeted on numerous occasions.
So this month marks the anniversary of emancipation in DC. How did women experience emancipation at the time?
I started off talking about how this was sort of more of a mutually reinforcing process rather than a patronizing process. And I think that their experiences help illuminate that, right? That there's the really important legislation that's passed in 1862 that frees enslaved people in the District of Columbia. And then there's the actual how that happens on the ground, right? And we all know from experience that, things can happen at the federal level, but then now when it's time to actually realize what these policies look like on the ground, it becomes a little more complicated and logistically very challenging. And so I always say that black women pick up where legislation leaves off, right? And so they're facing very resistant slave owners who do not think that Congress is within the constitutional parameters to actually abolish slavery in the district. People really believe that this is politically wrong, that this is legally not okay, right? Because they are entitled to rights to property. And so they defend their right to enslaved people, even though in DC, compensation is offered as a measure, to accommodate the property loss. Now, it doesn't really accommodate, the amount doesn't really accommodate. I think it's up to $300, right? And enslaved people leading up to the war are going for way more money than that. But it's something, but for some people it's not enough. And so a lot of slaveholders mount a huge resistance, and a very geographically interesting one, because Virginia is, right on the border, and so is Maryland. Maryland is loyal to the Union, and so Lincoln doesn't want to upset Maryland, right? That's the last thing they need. And then Virginia, right, becomes a particular kind of opportunity to undermine the Confederacy, right? So it becomes very complicated. Doesn't become that complicated for enslaved women though, right? They know that there's freedom in DC, so guess where they're headed? They're headed to DC. But for Maryland slaveholders who live in the district, some of them actually move their property over to the Maryland side in order to evade the law. And so it causes some complication. And so in the commissioner's records, you'll see enslaved women petitioning for their freedom against the slave owners' wishes, who have since moved to Maryland in order to secure their property. And so it's a very contentious process. It's a messy process, which, is not surprising, given that I don't think anyone at the start of the war thought emancipation was really going to sort of be the end result of the war, nor did they think it was going to be a war that lasted as long as it did. And so the government, locals, slaveholders, enslaved people, free black people are all kind of scrambling to try to figure out what emancipation is actually going to look like and how they're going to play a part in that. And so DC emancipation is really, really fascinating because now we have a really robust black community that is organizing at a highly a highly rapid and efficient rate to accommodate the influx of people who are coming in as a result of the DC Emancipation Act being passed. And some of my favorite stories are actually some of the enslaved folks who are coming from southern states who says, I'm gonna go to the White House, I'm gonna go talk to Mr. Lincoln, right? And because I have my freedom now, right? And so they see DC as this beacon of liberty that it was always supposed to be, right? But it takes for black people to come help make this a reality on the ground.
So you've talked about some of the sources you've used, and you mentioned the minor papers. Is there anything you found in either the library's collections or the archives that really just surprised you or struck you in terms of things you found?
I think the prostitution records were quite fascinating. Prostitution had existed in DC since the very beginning, right? But during the war, most of the black women who were getting arrested because they were soliciting Union soldiers. And so they became a problem, for locals who were concerned about the integrity and the morale of Union soldiers. McClellan was not doing well in the war at the time, right? And so many of them felt like, these Union soldiers, particularly in this region, are distracted, and they felt like black women had a role to play in that. But I thought what was also interesting is that there was a lot of interracial cooperation between white prostitutes and black prostitutes who were benefiting economically from the war. And I think that says something about the economic prospects of women at this time in DC, that this was such a viable local economy that they profited from during the war, so much so that they became a spectacle in the news and would make their way into court, make their way into jail, pay their fines, their very exorbitant fines, and then go right back to what they were doing, right? And so I think it was a broader commentary on what was possible for women, right? If you weren't married or if you didn't have a particular kind of class standing, then what was available to you in Washington? And it was not much, right? And so prostitution actually is more important than historians like to think it is.
Well, it's one of those things that is hard for us to talk about.
Oh, yes.
And there's a lot in this book that is hard to talk about.
Yes, yeah.
And so how have you found the conversations about the book with your students or with the public since you published?
It's been very interesting. I've actually been very excited about the level of interest in the book, and especially given how history has become this very contentious topic today. And I'm very interested in having conversation and interested in people's questions. And I think that, one of the things I tried to do in the book, that was actually challenging for me because I was actually living in Northern Virginia at the time, and so I spent a lot of time in DC, was to visualize the National Mall as being a site of the domestic slave trade. And I think that was really, it was hard for me to grapple with, and I imagine for people who really love this place and really get excited and get all the feels when they come visit DC, that's hard to visualize. And I think it opens up some really important conversations about our past that is difficult, right? But the story doesn't end there, right? And so using that as a place in which to have a good conversation and hear what people think, right?
So I really appreciate this conversation. Shall we move to questions from the room?
Please.
We have microphones, so if you can raise your hand, and we'll have one of the staff bring a microphone over.
Thank you so much, Professor Nunley, for this compelling presentation, and congratulations on the publication of your book.
Thank you.
I have a question about the role of imagination and even fiction in writing social history. I was thinking last year, Annette Gordon-Reed reviewed Saidiya Hartman's latest book in the New York Review of Books, and politely disagreed, let's say, about the extent to which historians can respond to archival absences or silences through invention. And I was wondering how you have negotiated this problem in your research and thinking, and where you land.
I love that question, and I read that review, and I teach both of their work, which is fun because it's a very generative discussion among students. For me, Annette Gordon-Reed's work is very important to me because I'm interacting with this idea of the nation, and I interact with Jefferson and the early Republic, and I think that her craft as a historian is really impeccable. But Saidiya Hartman gave me the permission, so to speak, to begin to sort of ponder the possibilities, right? And I frame them more as possibilities, right? And so rather than sort of strict critical fabulation where I'm like creating a narrative, I rather sort of invite the reader to maybe consider the possibilities of their worlds, right? And so rather than saying that Suki Dean decided this several decades before, why not perhaps, is it possible that she did, right? And even kind of posing it as, right, what do you think after reading this, right? And so I like to write in such a way where I'm inviting a conversation with the reader, and which is very antithetical to being a historian, right? Because we have to be very definitive and authoritative about our findings in order to be legitimate, right? But I'm very honest that there are things that I can be very authoritative about because there's so much evidence to support it. But in the enterprise of producing Black women's history, particularly in the early Republic and Civil War era, it's just so challenging to find the sources that really help us tease out what happened. And so I really focus on building a context and really filling up that context and grounding us in a sense of place. So that once I get that context, then I can begin to imagine the possibilities, right? And so the National Mall is a really great example of that. I can locate on a map, I can look at these street plans, I can look at records to see where there are slave pens. I can know how slave pens are organized. I can imagine that it's horrific, right? I can imagine that there are people who are deeply unhappy, right, in those pens. And so what does it mean then to walk along Pennsylvania Avenue and hear the cries of people in those slave pens? How does that then shape our understandings of what life is like in the nation's capital and help us to sort of contextualize the contradictions that shape this space? And so I do a little bit of both and, right? I gotta have a little Saidiya, and certainly some Annette Gordon-Reed. But I think Saidiya Hartman as also a literary critic and as someone who's not necessarily firmly anchored in the history discipline has kind of given us some permission to loosen up a little bit and maybe ask some different kinds of questions of the sources.
Questions from the audience? Can we just?
Thank you for your presentation, for your talk. I'm not very sure about the chronology of your study, but I was wondering if you observed maybe a difference between the decades right after the Civil War, before the segregation was institutionalized. Did the situation of these black women worsen after the
After the Civil War? That's a great question, right? So one of the things that drew me to DC was I was living in the area and I was like, man, they have this really robust African-American community, and I wonder how far that stretches, right? And I found that it stretches since its inception, since the nation's capital's inception, right? But a lot of what I had already known about DC and its black institutions was rooted in that sort of late 19th Jim Crow era, right, at the height of anti-black violence. And I would say that to compare that to the antebellum era is probably not as useful, right? But what I've always thought about, and this is my training in Black studies as an undergrad, was that Black people were always sort of engaged in an ongoing sort of continuum of a Black liberation struggle, right? And that there are these different moments in American history that kind of signpost how they respond to that struggle. And so I find that their response, Black women's responses to Jim Crow segregation is very vigorous, right? But then it didn't become surprising to me now that I knew what I knew about the antebellum era. But before I had written the book, I thought it was sort of unique to the late 19th century. But actually, Black women's organizing had preceded Jim Crow segregation. And so what you see is really a lot of innovation and grassroots movement building in DC among Black women during the late 19th century. You see more formalized institutions that have been critically funded by Black women themselves in these really industrious ways. And then you also begin to see the flourishing of those antebellum institutions during the late 19th century, right? So the early 19th century is when they're starting to form, but that's when, by the end of the 19th century, they're these really robust and become even more vital to have them because of the way that segregation takes shape.
Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. A question that I often ask also about books based on case studies of specific geographies, like an urban center, is how would you say the experience of Black women in this metropolis, like Washington, D.C., is it representative of other urban centers in the country? Like if someone is to write about the same topic and the experience of Black women in other, like in Boston or Charleston or other cities, would it be significantly different, or would it be very similar, or do you think there's something unique about DC that deserves to be treated in a whole separate book?
That's a great question. I think that there's something both similar and different about DC. So there's something similar to DC, say to a place like New Orleans, where there is a vibrant free Black community that has its own independent institutions. There's also the presence of Catholicism and orders that are inclusive of African descended people. That is also a parallel between the two. Also, the significance of Washington, D.C. and a place like Baltimore and New Orleans for the domestic slave trade absolutely connects these sort of respective metropoles. But I would say that DC is very unique in the sense that every sort of political leader is forced to come here and forced to wrestle with this issue together. Now, they don't succeed, right? So it goes awry, right? But for a half a century, they come here fighting it out, trying to figure out what this nation is, what it represents, And it's something about them having to be this transient population together, right, to leave their respective locales and actually come here and be unified as one that makes this place very interesting and fascinating. It's a place in which both free Black people thrive, right, but also enslaved people are subjected to a horrific slave trade, right? It's a place of these contradictions, right? And it's carved out of the oldest slaveholding states in the Union, beloved Virginia, right, and Maryland. And so I think geographically and politically, it's this really fascinating place. And you begin to see how fascinating it is during the Civil War when, you know, emancipation is set in motion in DC, but not necessarily in Maryland. And then, you know, they hope to use this policy, you know, to undermine the Confederacy in Virginia. And so in some ways it's unique, and then in some ways it's similar to other American cities.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting talk. My question, I guess, is that something that stood out to me whilst you were speaking, it's these ideas of like messiness, complexity, nuance, contradiction, and the idea of self-making, which seems to be fundamentally concerned with like individual agency and subjectivity as well. And I'm wondering, taking an approach that leaves space for all this messiness and contradiction in your writing, like what possibilities does that open up for you, and also what challenges did you find with like communicating so much to the reader?
Yeah, I think the space for complexity is one that you either really appreciate and enjoy or you do not. And I think that when this book was under peer review, in full transparency, there were folks who were like, this is amazing, and there were people who were like, I hate this, right? And so in some ways it goes back to the question about Saidiya Hartman and Annette Gordon-Reed. You either fall on one side of the spectrum, and I'm in the middle, right? And in some ways it's been very rewarding, and in some ways it leaves open even more questions than were left answered. And I kind of like it that way because I see that the scholarship on the early republic, on American history, on Black women's history, on slavery is always evolving. If we're doing our jobs, it's always evolving. And I'd rather trigger a conversation than to feel as though I had the final say. And that's just kind of my ethos as a historian. But I do think that because I made that kind of choice, to get it published, you know, was certainly challenging, right? To sell an editor on what I was trying to sell was it could be very challenging, right? And I was at the time, it was my first book, and so what editor wants to take that kind of risk, right? But I do hope that it sparks a lot of questions about DC. I mean, I'm hoping that more books about DC and in those early years in particular will be written. And so hopefully it started a conversation, but it has been rewarding for these kinds of forums to have a conversation with other folks, you know, who may not necessarily be as steeped in the historiography, but are very interested in a place like DC or interested in the early republic and American history. And in that way, it's been very rewarding.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm curious in some of these contradictions that have just been brought up in the lives of the Black women that you study in your book, the role of religion and maybe how such a powerful ideology would be used or not used, or used to justify the economics of prostitution, for example, or just abandoned altogether. Is that something that became a prominent thread in your studies of these?
Absolutely. So there's religion, and then there's the church, right? And so I think making that distinction is going to be really important as we think through this answer. Mainly because, and I'll give you an example. One of the Black codes stipulated that you could not be out past 10 o'clock as a Black person unless you had been vouched by a respectable white person, or you were at church. right? Church was one of the places where Black people could not only forge a religious culture, but a place in which they could engage a sort of a civic and political culture as well, because it was one of the few places where you wouldn't experience as much surveillance if you were forging another kind of institution, like a school or a brothel, right? Or any other kind of institution. And so I say that to say that there's a way in which many Black people can enter the church space for very different reasons than religious ones, right? Some of it is about forging a community ethic. Some of it is about networks of aid and care. Some of it is about political leadership, right? And it sort of being a site of politicization for Black people. Churches are also places in which enslaved people escape to, right? And so they become sites of refuge. So there's the church building itself, right? And then there's religion, which I think actually is absolutely important. And that Black people are forging a theology that's rooted in the idea of the sort of the connection between the Exodus stories, right? And the stories, the Hebrew stories that are tied to freedom from slavery, right? And so they are creating a Black liberation theology that becomes the basis for abolition, that becomes the basis for their political activism as abolitionists. And so religion becomes very important. Catholicism in DC is actually quite important to Black people. And churches across denominations become instrumental in helping to establish schools for Black girls and boys, for enslaved people, and also for free Black people. And so the church becomes actually this humongous source of community and engagement and identity formation. So yes, religion is certainly important.
So in a related vein, you talk about how there were debates as to how and whether girls and African American girls should be taught and how they should be taught. And so how did that play out in terms of the things that were taught in, for example, Martilla Minor's school or other schools?
Yeah, it was not uncommon for girls across race to be taught religious, sort of moral texts, the domestic arts, right, needlework and that sort of thing. But Martilla Minor School was a problem because they were teaching Latin, they were teaching aeronautics, they were teaching geography, they were teaching political philosophy. And these girls were just eating this up. They were consuming it. They were learning about anatomy in ways that reinforced the value of their bodies rather than sort of the racialization and the degradation of their bodies. They were learning the sciences. They were learning all of these things that they are being trained to then teach other Black children, right? And so that's what makes it kind of very transgressive, right? Because there were many white Southern girls who were not learning physics or not learning geography, right? And so for a Black girl to be learning that was, extremely offensive to lots of people.
So one of the things you mentioned is you have, in these papers, there are some of the writings of some of these girls, some of these students. Were you able, in any case, to place those young women later and find their stories as adults?
Mm-hmm. I absolutely was, and so they remained in DC. They started their own schools. They did exactly what they were trained to do, and they started their own schools in like their mom's house, right? And their mom, in one instance, there was a young lady who started a school, and her mom was a washerwoman. And she did not make a lot of money, but she would save her money so that she could help fund her daughter's education at Martilla Minor School. And then they collectively pooled their resources together to then start their own school for Black girls. And so it became this kind of movement of folks using their houses, using different venues, churches, church fellowship halls, right? Different kinds of spaces to start their own schools. And so it's this grassroots movement of educating Black DC across the city without any access to public support, even though they're paying taxes for public education.
So, one last question is just, we've talked about some of the folks who we learn about in your book. Is there somebody else we should really know about that whose story you'd like to talk about today?
There's a picture in the book of a woman named Alethia Tanner. And Alethia Tanner was enslaved and created her own garden plot and became involved in the marketplace, the big marketplace in DC. And she began to sell her goods from what she was growing in her garden. And eventually she purchased her freedom, and then she purchased her entire family's freedom. And then she helped pay for the first school, and then she helped pay for maybe 2 or 3 churches, and became sort of this huge benefactor. I call her the Oprah of early 19th century DC. And she was just an incredibly savvy businesswoman, but also someone who was thinking expansively about what her wealth meant to the broader community. And so she used that wealth to help establish the cornerstone of many establishments in DC. And it was when I found her in the archive, I actually found her in the Howard archives, that it came full circle to me. I was living in DC when I first started the project, and I was like, wow, they have this robust community of Black folks, and also these wonderful institutions. When did this all begin? And it was when I saw her that I was like, this is where it begins.
Well, this has been great. Dr. Nunley, thank you so much for your time today. We very much enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for your questions.
And as we mentioned, we'll be selling the book, and Dr. Nunley will be signing books next door. Thank you all for joining us today. And please check out our website. We have several more book talks for the rest of the month. And thank you for your time.